The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe burned low and gold that night, and beneath their trembling light stood a woman the guests had been told to admire but never truly see. She wore ivory silk, the color of surrender, gown chosen not by her own hand, but by his. Round her throat sat a collar of sapphires that had once belonged to a duchess long dead. A woman whose portrait watched from the east wall with eyes that seemed to know exactly what was coming. The orchestra played something light and forgettable, the kind of music meant to fill silence rather than stir feeling, and 200 of the finest families in England moved across the marble floor like pieces on a board whose rules only one man understood. He stood at her shoulder, now tall and immaculate, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it beneath the music. "Smile," he said, "for my guests." As though the words cost him nothing, as though 4 years of her life had not already been spent doing precisely that. She turned to him, and for one long moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath without knowing why, the way a room senses a storm before the first drop falls. Her answer did not come in words. It came in the quiet, deliberate act of setting down her glass upon a passing tray, of lifting the hem of that ivory gown, of turning her back on the Duke of Ashcombe in front of every soul who mattered in London society, and walking toward the doors as though they had been built for this exact moment and no other. Gasps rose behind her like a tide pulling back before a wave. Somewhere, fan clattered to the floor. The Duke, who had never in his life been refused anything by anyone beneath his roof, stood frozen in the candlelight, his composure cracking, for the first time in 4 long years, while the woman he had once called his greatest possession walked out into the night without once looking back. To understand why she did it, why a woman with nothing, no fortune, no family name left untarnished, no protector in the world, would choose ruin over another moment of his performance, one must return to the autumn 3 years before, to a smaller house, a colder hearth. Girl who had not yet learned that smiling was a currency some men believed they owned outright. Before the reader is carried further into this story, a brief word. If the tale that follows moves you, if the quiet defiance of a woman refusing to be owned stirs something familiar in your own chest, consider staying close. For there is more still buried beneath what has been shown tonight, and the truth, when it finally surfaces, will not be gentle. Now, let the candles burn backward, let the music reverse itself into silence, and let us begin where it truly started, in a house far smaller than Ashcombe, on a morning when Eleanor Vane still believed her father's debts were the worst thing that could happen to her. The house on Thorncastle Lane had once been a fine one, though by the autumn of 1811 its fineness had worn thin as old lace, visible only to those who remembered what it had looked like before. Eleanor Vane stood at the window of her father's study that morning, watching frost creep across the glass in slow silver veins, and she did not yet know that within the hour her entire life would be rearranged by men who had never once asked her opinion of the matter. Her father, Sir Alister Vane, sat behind his desk with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of ways to delay bad news. He was not a cruel man, only a foolish one, and foolishness in a gentleman of his standing had a way of compounding like interest until it swallowed everything a family had built across generations. The mills he had invested in the north had failed, the shipping venture he had been assured was safe, had gone down somewhere off the coast of Portugal, along with £40,000 that had never truly belonged to him. And now, sitting across from him with the patience of a man who has already won, was the Duke of Ashcombe. Eleanor had seen him only twice before, both times at a distance, both times struck by the peculiar quality he carried, the sense that he was always the only person in any room who fully understood what was happening in it. He was younger than she had expected for a man of such reputation, perhaps 35, with the kind of composed handsomeness that seemed less like a gift of nature and more like something he had built deliberately, brick by brick, the way he seemed to build everything. "Your father owes a considerable sum to interests I represent," he told her plainly, once she had been called into the room and the door shut behind her. Interests that could see this house and everything in it seized within the month. She remembered the way her father's hands had trembled on the desk, the way he could not meet her eyes. "And I have come," the Duke continued, "to offer a solution rather than a ruin." The solution, as he explained it with the smooth efficiency of a man reading from a ledger, was simple. Eleanor would come to Ashcombe. She would live under his protection as his ward, and in exchange her father's debts would be settled in full, his name preserved, his remaining years spent in comfort rather than disgrace. There was no mention, not yet, of marriage, though the shape of that intention hung in the room like smoke that had not yet found the ceiling. Eleanor had wanted to refuse. Every instinct in her young body had screamed at her to refuse, to tell this composed stranger that her life was not a debt to be settled on a ledger. But she had looked at her father, at the grey exhaustion in his face, at the portrait of her late mother on the wall behind him, painted the year before her death, still smiling, as though she had never once imagined her daughter would be bartered away in this very room. And Eleanor had said yes because there had been, in truth, no other answer available to a girl of 21 with no fortune and no power. She left for Ashcombe 3 days later with 2 trunks and a maid named Bess, who had served her family since childhood, and who alone among the household staff had refused to be dismissed when the money ran out. The carriage ride took the better part of a day, the countryside changing from the familiar hedgerows of home into something grander, colder, more deliberately beautiful, until at last the great house itself rose up out of the mist, like something that had been carved from the hillside rather than built upon it. Ashcombe was magnificent in the way that certain predators are magnificent, all elegant lines and quiet menace, and as the carriage rolled up the long drive, Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten that she would not fully understand for a very long time. The Duke was waiting on the steps to receive her, and behind him stood a small collection of servants, arranged with the precision of a man who left nothing to chance. And as she stepped down from the carriage, he offered her his arm, with a courtesy so perfectly measured it felt almost like a threat. "Welcome to your new home, Miss Vane," he said, and something in the way he said home made it sound less like a place of shelter and more like a place from which escape had already been quietly, carefully removed as a possibility. The first weeks at Ashcombe passed in a haze of unfamiliar rooms and unfamiliar rules, and Eleanor learned quickly that the house operated according to a rhythm entirely of the Duke's design. Breakfast at 8, always taken in the smaller morning room, whether or not he joined her. Correspondence reviewed and approved before it left the house, a fact she discovered only when a letter to her father returned to her 3 days later, with certain lines struck through in a hand that was not her own. Callers announced and screened by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, a woman whose loyalty to the Duke ran deeper than any affection she might have held for the girl now living under his roof. And always threading through every interaction, the quiet expectation that Eleanor would be grateful, would be pleasant, would smile at the right moments and speak at the wrong ones only when spoken to. It was Bess who first noticed the pattern, sitting with Eleanor by the fire one evening while the rest of the house slept. "He watches you the way a man watches an investment," Bess said quietly, her needle pausing over her mending. "Not the way a guardian watches a girl in his care." Eleanor had wanted to dismiss the observation, had wanted to believe that the Duke's attention, however constant, was simply the natural vigilance of a man who had taken on a considerable responsibility. But there were moments that troubled the comfortable version of events she tried to construct for herself. The way he would appear in doorways without sound, as though he had been standing there for some time before announcing himself. The way he asked, with apparent casualness, about her father's remaining acquaintances in London, about old family friends, about anyone who might still hold affection for the Vane name. The way he seemed, more than anything, deeply interested in what she knew and did not know about her own mother. a woman who had died when Eleanor was only 7 and whose memory had grown soft and indistinct with time, more feeling than fact. It was in the 3rd week that she found the letter. She had not been searching for it. She had gone into the Duke's study only to retrieve a book he had promised to lend her, and in reaching for it upon a high shelf, she had dislodged a small bundle of papers tucked behind the volumes, papers that fell to the floor in a scattered fan of yellowed correspondence. She should have gathered them without reading and returned them to their place. She told herself this later, many times in the quiet hours when guilt and curiosity wrestled for dominance in her chest. But her eye had caught, entirely by accident, the name Vane written in a hand she did not recognize, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The letter was old, dated some 2 decades prior, written to a man whose name had been carefully cut away from the top of the page, as though even the recipient's identity had needed to be erased. It spoke, in guarded and careful language, of an arrangement between 2 families, of a debt owed not in money, but in blood and silence, of a daughter who would one day need to be found and brought home to settle accounts her mother had left unsettled. Eleanor read it 3 times before the shape of what it might mean began to form in her mind, cold and unwelcome. She gathered the papers, returned them exactly as she had found them, and left the study with her heart hammering so violently she feared it might be heard through the walls. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and turned the words over and over, searching for an innocent explanation and finding none that satisfied her. Her mother's name had never once, in all her memory, been spoken as though it carried debts or accounts or arrangements. Her mother had been, by every account Eleanor had ever received, a gentle and unremarkable woman who had married beneath her modest fortune for love, died too young of a fever that had swept through the county, the summer Eleanor turned 7. But the letter suggested something else entirely, something that reached backward into a history Eleanor had never been permitted to see, and as she lay awake, watching shadows move across the ceiling, she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the depths of night, that her arrival at Ashcombe had never been about her father's debts at all. It had been about her. It had perhaps been about her from the very beginning. Long before the mills failed, and the shipping venture sank, and Sir Alistair Vane sat trembling behind his desk. Somewhere in this house, behind one of its many locked doors, lay the answer to what her mother had truly owed and to whom, and Eleanor understood that she would not rest, not truly, until she found it. Winter settled over Ashcombe with a heaviness that seemed to match the mood within its walls, and Eleanor found herself watching the Duke now, with a new and careful attention, studying him the way one studies a locked door for the seam that might reveal its hinges. He remained, on the surface, unfailingly courteous. He arranged for a modest allowance to be placed at her disposal, encouraged her to order new gowns from the finest modiste in the county, engaged a music master when he learned she had once played the pianoforte with some skill, and made a point, always, of inquiring after her comfort with the practiced solicitude of a man performing a role he had rehearsed many times before. But beneath the courtesy ran something colder, something Eleanor had begun to recognize in the particular way his eyes would settle on her during dinner, assessing rather than admiring, and in the questions he continued to ask, gently, persistently, about her mother's family, about relations she had never met, about a great-aunt in the north whose existence Eleanor had barely known before arriving at Ashcombe. It was during a dinner in late November, with only the 2 of them at the long table beneath the watchful, painted eyes of generations of Ashcombe ancestors, that he asked her outright whether her mother had ever spoken of a place called Ravensmoor. Eleanor set down her fork with careful control. "I have never heard the name," she said, which was, at that moment, entirely true. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that she could not name. Disappointment, perhaps, or calculation recalibrating itself. "Curious," he said finally, returning his attention to his wine. "Your mother's family held land there, once before it passed out of their hands. I had assumed the name might have survived in family memory." Eleanor said nothing, though her mind raced, turning the word Ravensmore over and over like a stone she could not put down. That night, she wrote to her father for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe, a careful letter asking, with feigned idle curiosity, whether he knew anything of her mother's family history, of a place called Ravensmore, of any debts or arrangements that might have passed down through her mother's line. The reply, when it came nearly a fortnight later, was shorter than she had hoped, and heavier with unspoken things than she had feared. "Your mother rarely spoke of her early life," her father wrote, in a hand that seemed thinner and more tired. "Than she remembered it, she came to our marriage with little family to speak of, save a sister she had long been estranged from. I never pressed her on the matter, and I confess I do not know the name you mention. If you have cause to ask, Eleanor, I beg you write to me plainly, for I find myself uneasy, not knowing what prompts such questions from you now." She could not write to him plainly. Not yet, not until she understood more herself, and so she folded the letter away and continued her quiet observations, growing bolder as the weeks passed. She began to notice that certain rooms in the house were kept locked at all times, their keys carried on a ring that never left the housekeeper's waist. She began to notice that letters arrived for the Duke bearing a seal she did not recognize, a raven in flight above a crescent moon, and that these letters were always read, alone in his study, with the door closed. And she began, most significantly, to notice a woman who appeared at Ashcombe perhaps once a fortnight, always in the late afternoon, always received privately by the Duke, a woman whose face Eleanor never saw clearly, but whose voice, once overheard through a partially open door, carried a familiar cadence that struck something deep and unplaceable in Eleanor's memory, a resonance she could not explain, but could not dismiss either. It was Bess, ever resourceful, who managed to learn the woman's name from one of the under-housemaids, a girl grateful for a kind word and a few coins. Mrs. Ney, Harlow the maid had said, though whether that was a true name, or simply what the household had been instructed to call her, none among the staff seemed entirely certain. Eleanor turned the name over in her mind for days without recognition, until one evening, watching the woman's carriage depart from her window, she caught a glimpse of a face turned briefly toward the house, and something in the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, struck her with such sudden and disorienting force that she had to sit down upon the window seat to steady herself. The resemblance was faint, easily dismissed as coincidence by anyone not already primed to search for connection in every shadow of this house. But Eleanor had spent 7 years staring at a portrait of her dead mother, memorizing every detail of a face she could no longer summon from memory alone. The woman in the carriage below wore, in the tilt of her chin and the line of her brow, an echo of that same face softened by time but unmistakable to a daughter's eye. She did not sleep again that night, and, by morning, she had resolved that whatever answers lay hidden within Ashcombe's locked doors, she would find them, whatever the cost, for she was no longer merely a ward paying her father's debt with her presence. She had become, without ever choosing it, a woman standing at the edge of a mystery that reached backward into her own blood, and she could not now turn away from it, even had she wished to. The Duke's true purpose revealed itself, not in a single dramatic confession, but in fragments, gathered slowly across the winter, like snow accumulating on a windowsill, until at last its weight could no longer be ignored. Eleanor began to spend her afternoons in the Ashcombe library, ostensibly reading, in truth searching, working her way through old estate ledgers and family correspondence with the patience of a woman who understood that the truth, once it surfaced, would likely arrive all at once and change everything that came after.
It was there, tucked within a bound volume of estate accounts dating back some 30 years,
that she found the document that gave shape to everything the fragments had been suggesting. It was a copy of a will, old and formal in its language, belonging to a woman named Margaret Ashworth, a name Eleanor did not recognize until she read further and understood, with a cold lurch of comprehension, that Margaret Ashworth had been her mother's elder sister, the estranged sister her father had mentioned so briefly in his letter. The will detailed an inheritance of considerable size, land at Ravensmoor, and a fortune tied up in trust, left divided between Margaret's two children upon their reaching their majority, with a curious provision that should either heir die without issue, the full inheritance would revert not to the remaining sibling, but to whichever surviving relation of the Ashworth bloodline could be legally established. A provision Eleanor suspected had been drafted by a lawyer more interested in complexity than clarity. Beneath the will, folded separately, was a second document, more recent, dated only 4 years prior, which recorded the death of Margaret Ashworth's son without heirs, leaving a single surviving child, a daughter, as the last legitimate claimant to the Ravensmoor inheritance. That daughter's name had been struck through and rewritten twice in the margin, as though the clerk copying the document had been uncertain how to properly record her, and beneath the crossed-out lines Eleanor could just make out, in faded ink, the words also known as Eleanor Vane, daughter of the late Catherine Ashworth Vane. Her hands had trembled so violently upon reading it that she nearly dropped the volume into the fire, beside which she sat. Her mother, the gentle, unremarkable woman she had spent her whole life believing herself to understand, had in truth been born an Ashworth, heir in her own right to land and fortune that had been quietly, deliberately buried beneath decades of estrangement and silence. And Eleanor herself was, by the strange and tangled logic of inheritance law, the last surviving claim to a fortune that the Duke of Ashcombe had clearly spent considerable effort and patience attempting to secure. She understood now why he had brought her to Ashcombe under the pretense of settling her father's debts. She understood now why he had asked so carefully about Ravensmoor, about her mother's family, about relations she had never known existed. And she understood, with a dawning horror that settled into her stomach like a stone, precisely what role marriage would play in his design, for a husband's claim upon his wife's inheritance was under the law as it stood, nearly absolute. And a wife who married without full understanding of what she brought to the union was a wife whose fortune could be quietly folded into her husband's estate with scarcely a question asked by anyone. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she could bring herself to act upon it, turning it over from every angle, searching for some interpretation that did not implicate the man beneath whose roof she now lived, some possibility that his interest was innocent, that the timing of her arrival and the timing of these discoveries was mere coincidence rather than design. But coincidence could not explain the letter she had first found tucked behind his study shelves, the one that spoke of a daughter who would need to be found and brought home to settle accounts her mother had left unsettled. Coincidence could not explain the woman called Mrs. Harlow, whom Eleanor now suspected, with growing certainty, of being some relation on the Ashworth side, perhaps even the aunt her father had mentioned, brought quietly into the Duke's confidence, and paid perhaps to keep silent about the true shape of the family she had once been estranged from. And coincidence could certainly not explain the increasing frequency, over those winter months, with which the Duke began to speak of marriage, gently at first, almost teasingly, testing the ground before her, watching her reactions with the careful attention of a man assessing whether his investment was ready to be collected. Eleanor began from that point forward to play a role she had not chosen, but understood she must perform if she hoped to survive what was coming. She smiled. More readily. She allowed herself to seem, in small and careful increments, to be softening toward him, to be growing accustomed to the idea of a future at Ashcombe that extended beyond mere guardianship. And all the while, behind the smile, she offered him across the dinner table each evening. Her mind worked with a cold and desperate clarity, searching for allies, for evidence, for any path that might lead her out of the trap that had been closing around her, slowly and patiently. Since the very morning he had first walked into her father's study and offered his elegant solution to a ruin he had very likely engineered from the start. It was Bess who first suggested that Eleanor was not entirely without allies within Ashcombe's walls, and it was through Bess's careful and quiet inquiries among the household staff that Eleanor first learned of a man named Josiah Cole, a solicitor's clerk who had once worked for the Ashworth estate before it fell into legal limbo following Margaret Ashworth's death, and who now lived in the nearby village of Farrow Dean, no longer employed by the Duke, but not entirely beyond his reach either. Reaching him proved its own delicate exercise in caution, for Eleanor understood by now that her correspondence was watched, her movements noted, her every interaction observed by a household whose loyalty belonged, almost without exception, to the man who paid their wages. It was Bess again who solved the difficulty, using her market-day errands as cover, to carry a carefully worded letter to the village, and it was on a grey afternoon in early February, under the pretence of accompanying Mrs. Capper Pruitt on a charitable visit to the poor of the parish, that Eleanor finally managed a stolen half-hour alone with Josiah Cole in the back room of the village apothecary, meeting arranged with such care that even now, recalling it, Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the memory of the risk they had taken. Cole was an older man, grey at the temples, with the tired, careful eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime handling other people's secrets and understood precisely how dangerous such knowledge could become. He confirmed in low and measured tones everything Eleanor had begun to suspect, and added details that turned her suspicion into something far darker and more deliberate than she had imagined. The Duke of Ashcombe, Cole explained, had first learned of the Ravensmore inheritance nearly 5 years prior, through his own family's tangled legal connections to the Ashworth estate, connections that gave him standing to petition for guardianship or influence over any surviving heir. He had spent those 5 years, patiently and quietly, tracing the scattered branches of the Ashworth family, and when his inquiries finally led him to Sir Alistair Vane and his daughter, he had not stumbled upon them by chance at all. Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady, whether her father's ruin had truly been an accident of misfortune or something arranged from the shadows, and Cole's silence, longer than she would have liked, told her more than any words could have. "I cannot say with certainty," he admitted finally, "but I can tell you that the man who purchased the failing shipping venture, your father invested in the one whose collapse triggered his ruin, was a company with ties, however distant, to the Duke's own holdings. Whether that was design or fortunate coincidence for a man already searching for a way into your life, I could not swear to before a court, but I would not, in your position, assume the latter." Eleanor left that meeting with a heavier heart than she had carried into it, understanding now that the man beneath whose roof she lived had very likely orchestrated not merely her arrival at Ashcombe, but the entire collapse of her father's fortune, a ruin that had cost an old man his health and his peace of mind, all in service of securing a fortune that belonged, by rights, to Eleanor alone. She returned to Ashcombe that evening with her composure carefully rebuilt, smiling at dinner as she had trained herself to do, listening to the Duke speak of an upcoming ball he intended to host in the spring, an event he described with a warmth that now struck her as entirely hollow, as an opportunity to formally introduce her to society as more than merely his ward. She understood the implication buried within his words, understood that the ball he spoke of would be the stage upon which he intended, at last, to announce their engagement, to seal the trap that had taken 5 patient years to construct. And as she nodded and smiled and expressed appropriate enthusiasm for the gowns that would need to be ordered and the guest list that would need to be finalized, she felt something within her harden into resolve. She would not simply wait for the trap to close. Cole had mentioned, almost in passing, a detail that lodged itself in her mind and refused to be dislodged, a rumor that had circulated some years before among the legal circles handling the Ashworth estate concerning a distant cousin of her mother's, a man who had once contested the succession of the Ravensmore inheritance, and who might, if he could be found and persuaded, hold documents or knowledge that could unravel the Duke's careful design entirely, If only Eleanor could reach him before the spring ball arrived, and the announcement of her engagement rendered any such evidence legally moot. The name Cole had given her was Captain Edmund Hale, and the moment Eleanor heard it spoken aloud in the apothecary's back room, something in her chest had gone very still, as though her body had recognized the name before her mind fully caught up to the memory it carried. She had known an Edmund Hale once, many years before, in the brief golden summer before her father's fortunes began their slow decline. A young naval officer, then only a lieutenant, who had spent several weeks visiting a cousin's estate neighboring the Vane property, and who had spent a good portion of those weeks in Eleanor's company. Walking the lanes and orchards of a childhood, she could still recall with startling clarity whenever she allowed herself the indulgence. She had been 17 that summer, and he not much older, and though nothing had ever been formally declared between them, there had been an understanding, unspoken but deeply felt, that something might have grown from those long afternoons had circumstance permitted it to. He had returned to sea that autumn with promises of correspondence, and for the better part of a year letters had passed between them, with a regularity that Eleanor had treasured more than she had ever admitted to anyone, not even Bess. And then, quite suddenly, the letters had stopped. She had written 3 times without reply, before her pride would allow her to write no further, and some months later news had reached her, second-hand and unconfirmed, that Lieutenant Hale's ship had been lost off the coast of the Americas with much of its crew, and Eleanor had spent that winter grieving a man she had never been permitted to properly love, folding the memory of him away into some quiet chamber of her heart, where she had assumed it would remain undisturbed for the rest of her days. To hear his name now spoken by a solicitor's clerk in connection with the very inheritance that had upended her life struck her with a confusion so profound she had barely managed to keep her composure through the remainder of the meeting. "He is not dead, then?" she had asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and Cole had looked at her with something like surprise, as though the connection between the young officer of legend and the man he spoke of had not occurred to him until that moment. "He returned to England some 2 years past," Cole confirmed. "Our captain retired from active service after an injury sustained in his final engagement. He took up residence at a small property near Kettlewick, no more than a day's ride from here, and it was he, in fact, who first contested certain aspects of the Ravensmore succession, on grounds, I confess, I never fully understood, though the matter was quietly settled before it reached any court of consequence." Eleanor had left that meeting with her mind reeling, torn between the professional urgency of what Cole's information meant for her legal situation and the private, aching disbelief that the man she had mourned for 4 years might be living and breathing barely a day's ride from where she now sat trapped within the Duke's careful design. It took her nearly a fortnight to summon the courage to act upon this knowledge, a fortnight spent smiling through dinners and enduring the Duke's increasingly proprietary attentions, while her mind worked ceaselessly at the puzzle of how to reach Kettlewick without raising suspicion. It was Bess, once again, who provided the solution, this time by suggesting that Eleanor request permission to visit a fictitious school friend said to be recovering from illness in a village conveniently positioned along the road to Kettlewick, a request the Duke, ever mindful of appearances and eager to demonstrate his generosity before the spring ball, granted without significant hesitation, though he insisted with the particular firmness that had come to characterize all his kindnesses, that Mrs. Pruitt accompany her for propriety's sake. Eleanor spent the carriage ride rehearsing what she might say, how she might explain her arrival at his door after 4 years of silence she had believed permanent, and by the time the carriage rolled to a stop before a modest but well-kept house on the edge of Kettlewick village, her heart was beating with such violence she feared Mrs. Pruitt must surely hear it from across the carriage. She left the housekeeper with the excuse of a private errand at the village apothecary, promising to return within the half-hour, and walked the remaining distance to Captain Hale's door on legs that felt scarcely capable of carrying her. And when the door opened and she found herself, after 4 years of grief and silence, Looking once more into the face of the man she had never stopped loving, despite every effort to convince herself otherwise, the shock upon his features told her, more plainly than any words could have, that he had believed her lost to him just as completely as she had believed him lost to her. And that, whatever conspiracy had kept them apart, these 4 years had been built, quite deliberately, on lies neither of them had chosen. The truth, once Edmund began to speak it, unravelled with a speed and a bitterness that left Eleanor gripping the arm of her chair to steady herself against its revelations. He had never stopped writing to her. He told her, seated across from her in his small, sparse sitting room, while a fire struggled against the February chill, his voice tight with a restrained fury that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface for years. His letters, he explained, had continued without pause, through that autumn and winter, growing increasingly desperate as her replies failed to arrive, until finally, believing himself forgotten or rejected, he had allowed himself to stop, his pride finally overcoming a hope that had begun to feel humiliating to sustain. It was only recently, he confessed, in the course of settling certain legal matters connected to his own distant relation to the Ashworth family, matters that had brought him briefly into contact with the same tangled inheritance now threatening to consume Eleanor's future, that he had learned, through an indiscreet remark from a clerk in the same solicitor's office that employed Josiah Cole, that a certain nobleman, with interests in the Ashworth succession, had, some years prior, taken considerable pains to intercept correspondence addressed to a young lady residing in the vicinity of Thorncastle Lane. He had not, at the time, connected the story to himself, not until he heard, quite by accident, the name Eleanor Vane mentioned in connection with the very Duke whose interference had apparently redirected the course of both their lives. The rage that moved through Eleanor upon hearing this was unlike anything she had experienced in the whole of her ordeal at Ashcombe, colder and sharper than the slow-building dread that had characterized her months of quiet investigation. For this was not merely a matter of fortune stolen or inheritance manipulated. This was 4 years of grief. 4 years spent mourning a love she had believed dead, when in truth it had simply been stolen from her by a man patient enough to remove every obstacle standing between himself and the fortune he intended to claim, including, apparently, a young officer's letters intercepted and destroyed before they could ever reach the girl waiting to receive them. Edmund, for his part, listened with a growing and terrible comprehension as Eleanor explained the full shape of what she had discovered across the winter, the will, the inheritance, the deliberate ruin of her father's fortune, the careful 5-year campaign that had brought her, step by patient step, into the Duke's household. And now, toward an engagement she had never wanted and could see no honourable way to escape. "He is preparing to announce our engagement at a ball this spring," she told him, her voice steadier now that the worst of her shock had passed into something harder and more resolved. "And once that announcement is made, once society has witnessed it and the arrangements begin, I fear there will be no path back from it, no way to contest what he intends without destroying what remains of my father's reputation and my own besides." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working with the particular tension of a man weighing dangerous possibilities. "There may yet be a path," he said finally. "My own contest of the Ravensmore succession, though quietly settled, left me in possession of certain documents. The Duke's solicitors were eager to have returned, documents that establish rather more clearly than I believe he would like, made public precisely how the succession came to favour your line over certain other claimants, and precisely what steps were taken, and by whom, to ensure that outcome. If those documents were to be presented publicly, at a time and place where the Duke could not quietly suppress them, as he has clearly suppressed every other obstacle in his path these 5 years, I believe the truth of his design would become impossible to deny, even to a society inclined to overlook the sins of a duke." Eleanor felt something kindle in her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in months, something dangerously close to hope. "And where," she asked, "might such a presentation be made with the greatest possible effect?" Edmund's answer, when it came, carried the particular grim satisfaction of a man who has waited 4 years for the chance to right a wrong done to him and to her. Why, he said, at the very ball where he intends to announce your engagement, before every witness whose good opinion he has spent his life so carefully cultivating. For a man like the Duke of Ashcombe fears nothing so much as the loss of the reputation he has built his entire fortune upon protecting. The weeks between that meeting in Kettlewick and the night of the spring ball passed for Eleanor in a strange suspended tension, each day requiring a performance more demanding than the last, for she now understood the full weight of what the Duke had taken from her. And every smile she offered him across the breakfast table cost her more than he could ever know. She and Edmund had agreed, in the careful hours of planning that followed his revelation, that the documents alone would not be sufficient, for a duke's word carried weight enough in most circles to cast doubt upon paper evidence produced by a man he could easily paint as a jealous rival with grievances of his own. What was needed was corroboration, a witness whose testimony could not be so easily dismissed, and it was here that the mysterious Mrs. Harlow re-entered the story, for Eleanor had never quite abandoned her conviction that the woman was connected, somehow, to her mother's estranged Ashworth family, perhaps even the very aunt who had contested Margaret Ashworth's estrangement decades before. Bess, whose network of quiet alliances among household staff across the county had proven itself invaluable time and again throughout the winter, managed at last to learn Mrs. Harlow's true name and situation through a coachman who had once driven her regularly before the Duke arranged for her transportation privately. She was, in truth, Margaret's younger sister, Eleanor's great-aunt, a woman named Frances Ashworth Harlow, who had been, for the better part of 2 years, quietly paid a generous stipend by the Duke in exchange for her silence regarding the true circumstances of the Ravensmore succession. A silence purchased not out of any loyalty to him, but out of a desperate need, following her own husband's death. For financial security she had no other means of securing. When Eleanor finally arranged, through considerable and delicate manoeuvring, a private meeting with her great-aunt under the pretense of a charitable visit, similar to the one that had first brought her to Kettlewick, she found in Frances Harlow not the calculating conspirator she had half feared, but a tired, guilt-ridden woman who wept almost immediately upon learning that the niece she had watched grow increasingly trapped within Ashcombe's walls was, in fact, family she had never been permitted to properly know. "I have hated myself for my silence every day since I agreed to it," Frances confessed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I told myself I had no choice, that an old woman alone in the world cannot afford scruples. She cannot eat or burn for warmth. But have watched you these past months, Eleanor, watched you grow paler and more careful with every visit, and I have known, God forgive me, precisely what fate awaited you, and said nothing to stop it." She agreed, that afternoon, to testify to the truth of what she knew, whatever the cost of the stipend that had kept her fed and housed these past 2 years. And Eleanor left Kettlewick that day with tears in her own eyes, moved not merely by the practical value of her great-aunt's cooperation, but by the strange, aching comfort of having found, after so many months of isolation within Ashcombe's gilded walls, a blood relation who looked upon her with genuine affection rather than calculation. The plan, as it finally took shape in the days leading up to the ball, was this. Edmund would attend the ball as an invited guest, his own modest but respectable connections to several families among the Duke's circle, securing him an invitation without difficulty or suspicion. Frances would attend as well, presented as a distant family friend, her presence unremarkable, until the moment it mattered most. And Eleanor herself would play her part as she had played it for months, smiling, gracious, appropriately radiant in whatever gown the Duke selected for the occasion, giving him no reason whatsoever to suspect that the evening he had spent 5 patient years constructing was about to collapse beneath the weight of its own carefully buried lies. It was a dangerous plan built upon timing that would need to be nearly perfect, and courage that Eleanor was not entirely certain she possessed. But as the night of the ball finally arrived and she stood before her mirror, while a maid pinned the last curls into place around the sapphire collar the Duke had insisted she wear, she found, beneath the fear, something steadier and more resolved than she had expected to feel. She was done, she realized, watching her own reflection with something like recognition after months of feeling like a stranger to herself, being smiled at by a man who had stolen her father's fortune, her lover's letters, and 4 years of her life, all in service of a fortune that had never truly been his to take. The ball itself unfolded exactly as the opening of this story first described it. The candlelight, the music, the 200 guests moving across the marble floor in their careful choreography of society and spectacle, and the Duke standing at Eleanor's shoulder with the easy confidence of a man who believed, correctly for, perhaps the first time in months, that every piece of his careful design was finally falling into place. He had made his intentions for the evening plain to her only that afternoon, informing her, with the particular warmth he reserved for moments of triumph, that he intended to announce their engagement before the assembled guests, once the dancing had concluded and the crowd had gathered for refreshments, a formal declaration that would, he explained, remove any lingering uncertainty about her position at Ashcombe and secure her future beyond all question. Eleanor had smiled and thanked him and said all the things a grateful ward might be expected to say, while behind her carefully composed expression her mind counted the minutes toward the moment she and Edmund had agreed upon. The moment when the orchestra would pause between sets and the Duke, ever attentive to the theatre of his own life, would seize the natural silence to make his announcement before the crowd could disperse toward the refreshment tables. She spotted Edmund across the ballroom perhaps an hour into the evening, dressed with a quiet dignity that suited him better, she thought, than any of the ornate fashions favored by the Duke's usual circle, and their eyes met only briefly across the crowded floor, before both looked away, careful not to betray the alliance that would, within the hour, done make everything. The Duke had spent 5 years constructing. She found Francis as well, seated near the edge of the room among the older guests, a folded leather portfolio resting inconspicuously upon her lap, and the sight of her great-aunt's steady, resolved expression gave Eleanor a courage that carried her through the remaining hour of dancing and small talk, with a composure that would, she reflected later, have made an excellent actress of her had circumstances required a different life entirely. When the moment finally came, the Duke did precisely as anticipated, raising his voice as the music paused and the crowd began to drift toward the refreshment tables, calling for the attention of his guests with the easy authority of a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered. "My friends," he began, his hand finding Eleanor's and drawing her forward beside him with a proprietary gentleness that made her skin crawl, even as she allowed it. "I have gathered you here tonight not merely for the pleasure of your company, welcome as it always is, but to share news I have long anticipated with the greatest happiness." It was here, precisely as planned, that Eleanor spoke, her voice carrying across the sudden hush of the ballroom with a clarity and steadiness that surprised even herself. "Before your Grace continues," she said, and the room turned toward her with the particular attentiveness that scandal always commands, "I believe, there is a matter of considerable importance that ought to be addressed first, concerning the very fortune that has, I have recently learned, motivated your Grace's interest in me from the very beginning." The Duke's composure did not crack immediately, not in that first instant, for he was a man well practiced in maintaining his mask before an audience, but Eleanor watched something shift behind his eyes. A recalculation, beginning even as his mouth curved into a smile meant to dismiss her words as the nervous chatter of a young woman overwhelmed by the occasion. "My dear Eleanor," he said smoothly, "whatever can you mean?" But before he could steer the moment back toward his prepared announcement, Edmund had stepped forward from the crowd, the leather portfolio now open in his hands, and Francis had risen from her seat near the edge of the room, and between the two of them, in careful and devastating succession, the truth that Eleanor had spent months uncovering was laid before 200 witnesses, who would carry the story of this night into every drawing room in London by the following week. The documents Edmund presented established, language too precise and too well corroborated to be easily dismissed, the true history of the Ravensmore succession and the considerable, deliberate steps the Duke had taken across 5 years to engineer both Sir Alister Vane's ruin and his daughter's arrival at Ashcombe. Francis' testimony, delivered through tears that carried far more weight with the assembled guests than any composed statement could have, confirmed every detail, admitting openly her own complicity, purchased through years of quiet payments she could no longer, in good conscience, allow to buy her silence. And Eleanor, standing at the centre of it all, in her ivory gown and her borrowed sapphires, watched the Duke of Ashcombe's carefully constructed reputation begin to crumble in real time before the very society he had spent his entire life cultivating, watched the calculating composure finally truly crack, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grace after so many months of fear, that she owed this man nothing further, not her gratitude, not her hand, and certainly not the smile he had demanded of her only moments before, as though it were his by right rather than hers to give or withhold as she chose. What happened next has already been described, though perhaps its full weight could not be understood until every piece of what came before it had been laid bare. Eleanor set down her glass. She lifted the hem of her ivory gown, and she turned away from the Duke of Ashcombe, from the guests whose gasps rose behind her, like a tide pulling back before a wave, from the sapphires at her throat that had never truly been offered, but merely loaned, as a leash is loaned to a creature its owner intends eventually to collect. Walked toward the doors of the ballroom with a steadiness that surprised even her, for she had expected in the moment she had imagined this scene so many times across the preceding weeks to feel triumph, or fear, or some combination of both. And, instead, she felt only a vast and settling calm. The particular peace that comes to those who have finally set down a weight they had carried so long, they had nearly forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The Duke did not follow her, not immediately, for even in the wreckage of his exposure, he understood, with the cold calculation that had characterized every decision of his adult life, that pursuing her through the ballroom before 200 witnesses would only compound the ruin already unfolding around him. He remained instead where he stood, his mask finally fully broken, his composure abandoning him at last in front of the very audience he had spent his existence performing for. And by the time Eleanor reached the great doors of Ashcombe and stepped out into the cold spring night, she could hear behind her the low, rising murmur of 200 voices already beginning to reshape the story of the Duke of Ashcombe into something considerably less flattering than the one he had spent 5 years constructing. She did not go far that night, only to the small carriage Edmund had arranged in advance, waiting discreetly at the edge of the drive, and when he found her there some minutes later, having made his own careful exit from the chaos still unfolding within the hall, he said nothing at first, only reached for her hand as she climbed into the carriage beside him. And Eleanor found that his silence, gentle and steady and entirely without demand, said more to her in that moment than any declaration could have. The weeks that followed brought a reckoning of their own, for the Duke's ruin once begun could not easily be contained, and the scandal that had erupted within his own ballroom spread through London society with the particular ferocity reserved for the four of men who had spent their lives believing themselves untouchable. Legal proceedings followed, slow and complicated as such matters always were, but Josiah Cole's careful documentation and Francis Harlowe's willing testimony provided a foundation sturdy enough that Eleanor's claim to the Ravensmore inheritance was, within the year, formally and finally recognized, restoring to her not merely a fortune and an Ashworth heritage her mother had carried in silence and shame, for reasons Eleanor never fully untangled, though she came in time to understand that her mother's estrangement from her family had likely been born of the very same patterns of control and manipulation that had nearly claimed her own life at Ashcombe. Sir Alister Vane, informed at last of the full truth of his ruin, wept when Eleanor visited him that spring, an old man's tears for a daughter he had unknowingly sold to settle a debt engineered specifically to place her within reach of the very fortune she alone was destined to inherit. And, though the years that followed could not undo the damage done to his health or his pride, he lived to see his daughter restored to a position far grander than the one their family had lost. And he lived, too, to see her married, the following autumn, to a retired naval captain of modest fortune but considerable character. In a small ceremony at Ravensmoor itself, the estate finally, rightfully reclaimed, attended by no more than 30 guests who had earned their place through genuine affection rather than social calculation. The Duke of Ashcombe faded from society's regard as thoroughly as he had once dominated it, his name spoken thereafter only in whispered cautionary tales exchanged between mothers and daughters preparing for their own entrances into a world that could, as Eleanor had learned so painfully, hide predators behind the most elegant of manners, and Eleanor herself, standing years later at the window of her own study at Ravensmoor, watching her children play upon the lawn while Edmund worked contentedly nearby among his roses, would sometimes recall that night at Ashcombe, the candles burning low and gold, the Duke's voice at her shoulder demanding a smile she had no longer been willing to give. And she would feel, even at that distance, a quiet flicker of the same fierce resolve that had carried her through the doors and out into the cold spring air toward a life she had, at last, chosen entirely for herself.